Elena Vasquez was only 5 years old when she first heard a piano. It happened on a dusty afternoon, in the small Argentine town, where she grew up. Her grandmother had taken her to the church for a baptism ceremony, and while the adults talked and laughed, little Elena wandered off toward the front of the building. That's when she saw it. An old wooden piano sat in the corner, its keys yellowed with age, its surface scratched and worn. But to Elena, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She climbed onto the bench, her tiny legs dangling above the floor, and pressed a single key. The note rang out through the empty space, and something inside her shifted. She didn't understand it then, but that moment changed the direction of her entire life. From that day forward, Elena was obsessed. She begged her grandmother to let her play the church piano whenever they visited. The old priest, a kind man with gentle eyes, noticed her fascination and began teaching her simple melodies. He saw something special in this quiet girl who seemed to come alive only when her fingers touched the keys. But Elena's family was poor. Her father had left before she was born, and her mother worked long hours at a textile factory just to keep food on the table. There was no money for piano lessons. There was certainly no money for a piano. For years, Elena practiced only at the church, sometimes walking 2 miles in the hot sun just to play for an hour before the evening service. Then, when Elena turned 12, everything changed. Her grandmother, a woman who had worked her whole life cleaning other people's houses, did something extraordinary. She had been saving money in a tin box under her bed for almost a decade. Coin by coin, peso by peso. She had put aside every extra bit she could spare. And on Elena's 12th birthday, she used all of it to buy a second-hand upright piano from a family across town. The piano was old and battered. Some of the keys stuck. The wood was chipped in several places. But when Elena saw it sitting in their tiny living room, she burst into tears. She hugged her grandmother so tight that the old woman laughed and said she couldn't breathe. "This is your future," her grandmother told her that night. "I don't know where it will take you, but I know it will take you somewhere. Promise me you'll never give up on it." Elena promised, and she meant it with every piece of her heart. From that day on, Elena practiced constantly. Before school, after school, late into the night. When her mother begged her to go to sleep, she taught herself by listening to recordings on an old radio her grandmother kept in the kitchen. She would hear a piece once, then rush to the piano and try to figure it out by ear. It took hours, sometimes days, but she refused to quit until she got it right. By the time she was 16, people in town started talking about her. They called her a prodigy, a miracle, a gift from God. The local newspaper wrote a small article about her. A teacher from the Buenos Aires Conservatory heard about her and offered her a partial scholarship to study in the city. Leaving home was the hardest thing Elena had ever done. Her grandmother was getting older, and her mother needed help with the house. But both of them pushed her to go. "Don't stay here for us," her mother said, her eyes wet with tears she was trying to hide. "Go make something of yourself. That's what we want more than anything." So Elena went. She spent 2 years at the conservatory, learning everything she could. But the scholarship only covered part of her expenses, and eventually, the money ran out. She had to return home without finishing her studies. It felt like failure. It felt like the end of everything she had worked for. But Elena refused to let it break her. She kept practicing, kept learning, kept pushing herself harder than ever. She entered local competitions and won most of them. She played at weddings, at funerals, at any event where someone would pay her a few pesos to perform. And slowly, she began to dream of something bigger. That's when she heard about the Vienna Masterclass. Every summer, the legendary Maestro Heinrich Brenner held an exclusive program for the most promising young pianists in the world. Getting accepted was almost impossible. Thousands applied, and only 20 were chosen. But those 20 went on to have careers that most musicians only dreamed of. Brenner had trained some of the greatest pianists of the past 50 years. His name alone could open doors that would otherwise stay locked forever. Elena knew this was her chance. Maybe her only chance. She saved every peso she earned for 2 years. She sold her few pieces of jewelry. She borrowed money from relatives who didn't have much to spare. And finally, at 23 years old, she bought a one-way ticket to Vienna. The day of the audition arrived gray and cold. Elena had never experienced European winter before, and she shivered as she walked through the grand entrance of the Vienna Conservatory. The building was enormous, all marble floors and high ceilings, and paintings of composers who had died centuries ago. Everything about it screamed history and importance, and a kind of excellence that felt completely out of reach. The waiting room was filled with other candidates. Elena looked around and felt her confidence shrinking with every passing second. These people were different from her. They wore expensive clothes. They talked about their teachers at famous schools, their performances at prestigious halls, their connections with important people in the music world. They belonged here. Elena felt like an imposter who had somehow snuck in through the back door. She found a seat in the corner and tried to calm her nerves. She closed her eyes and thought about her grandmother's hands, wrinkled and worn from years of hard work. She thought about the old piano in their living room, the one that still sat there waiting for her to come home. She thought about every sacrifice her family had made to give her this opportunity. She couldn't waste it. She wouldn't. When her name was finally called, Elena walked into the auditorium on legs that felt like they might collapse at any moment. The room was vast and intimidating, with rows of empty seats stretching back into darkness. A single spotlight illuminated the stage where a beautiful Steinway grand piano waited for her. And there, sitting at a table near the front, was Maestro Heinrich Brenner himself. Elena had seen photographs of him, but they hadn't prepared her for the reality. He was in his 70s, with silver hair swept back from a sharp, angular face. His eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of a man who had spent his life judging others and finding them lacking. He didn't smile when she entered. He didn't even look up from the papers in front of him. Elena walked to the piano and sat down. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she placed them on the keys and took a deep breath. "Wait," Brenner said. His voice was flat, almost bored. "Before you play, tell me about yourself. Where did you study?" Elena swallowed hard. This was the question she had been dreading. "I studied at the Buenos Aires Conservatory for 2 years," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But I did not complete my degree. Before that, I was mostly self-taught." Brenner finally looked up. His eyebrows rose slightly, and something flickered across his face. It might have been curiosity. It might have been contempt. Elena couldn't tell. Self-taught. He repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them sour. "How quaint. And what piece have you prepared for us today?" "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor." He nodded, a small, dismissive gesture. "Very well. You may proceed." Elena turned back to the piano. She placed her fingers on the keys. She thought about her grandmother, about her mother, about the little girl in the church who had pressed that first key and felt her whole world shift. Then she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade filled the auditorium like a whisper. Elena let her fingers find their way across the keys. Gentle at first, almost hesitant. This was how the piece began, soft and searching, like someone trying to remember a dream they had the night before. She had played this piece 1,000 times. In her tiny living room back home, while her grandmother listened from the kitchen, in the practice rooms of the Buenos Aires Conservatory, when everyone else had gone home for the night. In her head during those long hours working odd jobs to save money for this trip. This piece was part of her. It lived inside her bones. As the music grew, Elena felt herself disappearing into it. The cold auditorium faded away. The intimidating rows of empty seats vanished. Even Maestro Brenner, sitting there with his sharp eyes and his judgment, became nothing more than a shadow in the corner of her awareness. All that existed was the piano and the story she was telling through it. The ballade was a journey. It started with longing, moved through moments of tenderness and hope, then built toward storms of passion and conflict. Elena played every emotion as if she had lived it herself. And in many ways, she had. She thought about her father, the man she had never known, and the empty space he had left in her life. She thought about her mother's tired eyes after long shifts at the factory. She thought about her grandmother's hands, rough and calloused, placing coins into that tin box year after year so that one day her granddaughter might have a chance at something better. The middle section of the piece exploded with intensity. Elena's fingers flew across the keys, hitting notes with precision and fire. Her whole body moved with the music, swaying and leaning as if the piano was an extension of herself. This was where Chopin had poured his own heartbreak into the composition, and Elena matched it with her own. Then came the quiet moment before the final storm. Elena softened her touch, letting the notes hang in the air like falling leaves. She could hear her own breathing, could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. Almost there, just a little further. The ending of the ballade was ferocious. It demanded everything a pianist had, and then asked for more. Elena attacked it with everything inside her. Her fingers moved so fast, they became a blur. The music crashed and roared, and finally, came to its devastating conclusion. The last chord rang out through the auditorium. Then silence. Elena sat at the piano, her chest heaving, her hands still resting on the keys. She had given everything she had. Every drop of emotion. Every hour of practice. Every sacrifice her family had made. It was all there in that performance. She looked up at Maestro Brenner. He was writing something on his papers. He didn't look impressed. He didn't look moved. He looked like a man making a grocery list. After what felt like an eternity, he set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. He studied Elena the way someone might study an insect they had found on their windowsill. "Well," he said. Elena waited. She could feel the other candidates watching from the wings, could sense their curiosity and their nervousness. Everyone wanted to know what the great Brenner would say. He let the silence stretch out, clearly enjoying the tension. Then he smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who was about to enjoy themselves at another person's expense. "Tell me," he said. "Who taught you to play like that?" "Wait. Don't answer. I already know. No one taught you. That much is obvious." A few nervous laughs came from somewhere behind Elena. She felt her face growing hot. Brenner continued. "You have passion, I'll give you that. Plenty of passion. You feel the music deeply. Anyone can see that. But feeling is not enough. My dear, a child feels things deeply. A dog feels things deeply. What separates a true artist from a street performer is discipline, technique, understanding." He stood up and walked toward the stage, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He stopped a few feet from the piano and looked at Elena with something like pity. "Your tempo was inconsistent throughout the first movement. Your dynamics were exaggerated to the point of melodrama. Your rubato, in the lyrical sections, was so excessive it bordered on self-indulgence. And your technique in the final passages was sloppy. You were hitting notes through sheer force of will, rather than proper form." Each criticism landed like a punch to Elena's stomach. She wanted to defend herself. Wanted to explain that she had worked harder than anyone to get here. That she had overcome obstacles these privileged students couldn't even imagine. But her throat had closed up, and no words would come. Brenner wasn't finished. "I've seen many pianists like you over the years," he said. "Talented, yes. Passionate, certainly, but ultimately limited by their lack of proper training. You play like a peasant girl who learned from a scratched record in some dusty village. There is charm in that, I suppose. A certain rustic authenticity. But charm doesn't fill concert halls. Charm doesn't win competitions. Charm doesn't make a career. More laughter from the wings now. Louder and more confident. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him that satisfaction. Brenner walked back to his seat and sat down with a sigh. My advice to you, Miss Vasquez, is to return home. Go back to your village and play for people who don't know any better. Play at weddings and funerals and local festivals. Make people happy with your charming little performances. But don't waste your time chasing dreams that are beyond your reach. Not everyone is meant for greatness. There's no shame in accepting that. He picked up his pen and made a mark on his papers. A rejection, Elena knew. Her fate sealed with a single stroke. You may go, he said without looking up. Next candidate, please. Elena sat frozen at the piano. Her mind was spinning, her heart was breaking, and some small, fragile part of her wanted to collapse right there on the stage and never get up again. But then she thought about her grandmother. She thought about that old woman working on her hands and knees, scrubbing other people's floors, saving every coin for 10 years so that her granddaughter could have a piano. She thought about what her grandmother would say if she could see her now. Get up, Mija. Don't let them see you broken. You are stronger than this. Elena stood. Her legs were shaking, but she forced them to hold steady. She looked at Brenner one last time, and she did something that surprised even herself. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't beg for another chance. She simply nodded and said, in a voice that was quiet but clear, "Thank you for your feedback, Maestro." Then she turned and walked off the stage. The other candidates parted to let her through. Some of them looked at her with sympathy. Others looked at her with barely disguised relief, glad that they weren't the ones who had just been publicly destroyed. One young man, a tall fellow with expensive shoes and a smug expression, actually chuckled as she passed. Elena kept her eyes forward and her head high. She walked through the waiting room, past the marble columns and the portraits of dead composers, out through the grand entrance and into the cold Vienna afternoon. Only when she was alone on the street, with the gray sky pressing down on her and the wind cutting through her thin coat, did she finally let the tears fall. She cried for everything. For the humiliation she had just endured. For the dream that seemed to be slipping away. For her grandmother, who had given so much and would be so disappointed. For herself, the little girl who had pressed that first piano key in a dusty church and dared to believe she could be something more than what the world expected. She stood there on that Vienna street, crying and shivering, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. But even in that moment of despair, even when everything seemed hopeless and the maestro's cruel words echoed in her head, something inside Elena refused to die completely. A tiny spark, buried deep beneath the pain and the humiliation. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She took a deep breath of the cold air, and she started walking, not toward the airport, not toward home, but deeper into the city. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what she was going to do. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't ready to give up. Elena found a small room to rent in a rundown building on the outskirts of Vienna. It was barely bigger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a single window that looked out onto a brick wall, and a radiator that worked only when it felt like it. The wallpaper was peeling, and she could hear her neighbors through the thin walls at all hours of the night. But it was cheap, and cheap was all she could afford. She called her mother that first night. It was the hardest phone call she had ever made. "How did it go?" her mother asked, and Elena could hear the hope in her voice. It nearly broke her all over again. "I didn't get in," Elena said. She kept her voice steady, but her hands were shaking. The maestro said, "I wasn't good enough. He said I should go home." There was silence on the other end. Then her mother spoke, and her voice was fierce. "That man doesn't know you. He saw you for 5 minutes. 5 minutes doesn't tell him anything about who you are or what you can do. Mama, maybe he was right. Maybe I'm not. Don't you dare finish that sentence." Her mother's voice cracked, but she kept going. "Your grandmother didn't say for 10 years so you could give up after one bad day. I didn't watch you practice until your fingers bled, so you could let some arrogant old man decide your future. You decide your future. You hear me? Elena closed her eyes. Tears were running down her face again, but this time they felt different. Less like despair, and more like something else. Something that burned. I hear you, Mama. Good. Now, what are you going to do? Elena looked around her tiny room. She thought about the return ticket sitting in her bag. She thought about going home, admitting defeat, spending the rest of her life wondering what might have been. Then she thought about Brenner's face. That smug, dismissive expression, the way he had called her a peasant girl. I'm going to stay, she said. I'm going to prove him wrong. Her mother laughed through her tears. That's my girl. The next morning, Elena went looking for work. She couldn't touch the little money she had left because she would need it for food and rent while she figured out her next move. She walked through the city for hours, asking at restaurants, hotels, shops. Her German was terrible, and most people just shook their heads and waved her away. Finally, late in the afternoon, she found a small cafe tucked away on a quiet side street. The owner was a heavy-set woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and flour dusted on her apron. She listened to Elena stumble through her request in broken German, then held up her hand. You wash dishes? She asked in English. Yes, Elena said quickly. I wash dishes. I clean. I do anything. The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. You start tomorrow. 6 in the morning. Don't be late. Elena almost hugged her. She managed to hold herself back, but just barely. Thank you. Thank you so much. The work was hard. Elena spent 10 hours a day on her feet, scrubbing pots and plates until her hands were raw and red. The kitchen was hot in summer and cold in winter, and by the end of each shift, her whole body ached. But she never complained. She showed up early, stayed late, and did whatever was asked of her. The cafe owner, whose name was Brigitte, noticed. After a few weeks, she started giving Elena extra food at the end of her shifts. Leftover pastries, soup that would have been thrown away, bread that was a day old but still perfectly good. It wasn't charity, Brigitte insisted. It was just practical. But the food wasn't what Elena needed most. What she needed was a piano. She found one at the university. The music building had practice rooms that students could reserve. But late at night, after the last classes ended and the halls grew quiet, some of those rooms were left unlocked. Elena discovered this by accident one evening when she was walking past the building and saw a student slip out a side door, leaving it propped open with a book. She waited until the student was gone, then crept inside. The hallways were dark and silent. She found an empty practice room with an upright piano against the wall. She sat down, placed her hands on the keys, and for the first time since her audition, she played. From that night on, Elena lived a double life. By day, she was a dishwasher. Invisible and unremarkable. Just another immigrant trying to survive in a foreign city. By night, she was a pianist, pouring everything she had into the music that still burned inside her. She practiced differently now. Before, she had played mostly by instinct, letting her emotions guide her. But Brenner's words haunted her. Passion without technique is just noise. He was cruel, but he wasn't entirely wrong. She had relied too much on feeling and not enough on precision. So she changed her approach. She found old technique books in second-hand shops and studied them until the pages were worn soft. She listened to recordings of the great pianists, not just for enjoyment, but for analysis. She would play a single passage 50 times, 100 times, adjusting her hand position, her wrist angle, her finger pressure, until it was perfect. She also started seeking out teachers. Not the famous ones at the conservatory, but retired musicians who had stepped away from the spotlight. She found a former concert pianist who now lived alone in a small apartment. Her performing days ended by arthritis. The old woman agreed to give Elena lessons in exchange for help with groceries and cleaning. You have talent, the old woman told her, after their first session. Real talent. But talent is like a wild horse. It will carry you far, but only if you learn to control it. Elena took those words to heart. She worked on her control, her discipline, her technique, but she never let go of the passion that had always driven her. She learned to balance the two, to let them strengthen each other, instead of fighting. Months passed. The seasons changed. Elena's hands grew calloused, from dish soap and piano keys alike. Some nights, she was so exhausted, she could barely keep her eyes open during practice. Some mornings, she woke up wondering if she was crazy, if she should just give up and go home. But every time those thoughts crept in, she remembered Brenner's face. She remembered the laughter of the other candidates. She remembered the word, peasant, spoken with such contempt, and she kept going. After about a year, Elena started entering competitions. Small ones at first, local events that nobody important attended. She won her first competition by such a wide margin that the judges asked her where she had studied. When she told them she was mostly self-taught, they looked at her like she was lying. She won her second competition too. And her third. Word began to spread in the Viennese music community about this unknown young woman from Argentina who played with both fire and precision. A critic who attended one of the competitions wrote a small piece about her in a local arts publication. A rare combination of technical mastery and emotional depth, he wrote. Miss Vasquez is a name worth remembering. Elena cut out that article and taped it to the wall of her tiny room. She looked at it every night before she went to sleep, and every morning when she woke up. She wasn't the same pianist who had walked into that audition hall a year ago. She had torn herself apart and rebuilt herself from the ground up. She had taken every criticism Brenner had thrown at her and used it as fuel. She was better now, stronger, more complete. But she wasn't finished yet, because one afternoon, while taking a short break behind the cafe, Elena saw a poster taped to a lamppost. It announced an open recital showcase at the Grand Concert Hall in the center of Vienna. Any pianist could sign up to perform. And there, at the bottom of the poster, was a name that made her heart stop. The event would be judged and critiqued by special guest Maestro Heinrich Brenner. Elena stared at that name for a long time. Then she pulled out her phone and signed up for the showcase. It was time to face him again. Elena spent the next 3 weeks preparing like her life depended on it. In many ways, it did. She had thought long and hard about what piece to play. Part of her wanted to perform the Chopin Ballade again, the same piece Brenner had torn apart a year ago. It would be poetic, a chance to show him how wrong he had been. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that wasn't the right choice. She didn't want to prove she could play the same piece better. She wanted to prove she could do something he never believed she was capable of. She wanted to leave no room for doubt, no space for excuses, no way for him to dismiss her again. So she chose Liszt's La Campanella. It was one of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. The name meant the little bell in Italian, and it was inspired by the sound of a small bell ringing. But there was nothing small about the technical demands it placed on a pianist. The piece required enormous leaps across the keyboard, some spanning nearly 2 octaves. It demanded lightning-fast trills and delicate passages that had to sound effortless even though they were anything but. Many professional pianists avoided it entirely because the risk of making mistakes was so high. Elena had never performed it publicly before. She had learned it years ago, back in Argentina, but she had always considered it too dangerous for competition. One slip, one missed note, and the whole performance could fall apart. But that was exactly why she chose it now. If she could play La Campanella perfectly, no one could say she lacked technique. No one could call her a peasant girl who played by instinct alone. She would force Brenner to see her for what she had become. She practiced the piece obsessively. Every spare moment she had, she was at the piano. Her fingers moved through the passages over and over until they knew the music better than her own heartbeat. She practiced the difficult sections at half speed, then 3/4 speed, then full speed. She practiced with her eyes closed. She practiced until her hands cramped, and her shoulders ached, and her mind begged for rest. Brigitte noticed the change in her. One evening, after Elena's shift at the cafe, the older woman stopped her before she could rush out the door. "Something is different with you," Brigitte said. "You have fire in your eyes." "What's happening?" Elena hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about the showcase. Part of her was afraid that saying it out loud would jinx it somehow. But Brigitte had been so kind to her over the past year, and Elena felt she owed her some explanation. "There's a piano competition," Elena said. "A big one. The man who rejected me last year will be there. I'm going to play for him again. Everything. After that, everything." Brigitte studied her face for a long moment. Then she smiled. "Good. You show him what you're made of." The night before the showcase, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, running through the piece in her mind. Every note, every phrase, every tiny detail. She thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The church piano in her hometown, her grandmother's sacrifice, the humiliation of that first audition, the year of struggle and growth and transformation. Tomorrow, it would all come together, or it would all fall apart. She finally drifted off sometime around 3 in the morning, and when her alarm went off at 7, she felt like she hadn't slept at all. But she got up anyway. She showered in the tiny shared bathroom down the hall. She put on the only nice dress she owned. A simple black one she had bought at a second-hand shop months ago. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror above her sink. "You can do this," she whispered. "You have to do this." The concert hall was magnificent. Elena had walked past it many times over the past year, but she had never been inside. The lobby was all polished marble and golden light, with enormous chandeliers hanging from ceilings so high they seemed to touch the sky. Well-dressed people milled about, talking in hushed voices, holding programs printed on expensive paper. Elena felt out of place immediately. Her dress suddenly seemed cheap and worn. Her shoes, which had looked fine in her tiny room, now seemed scuffed and old. She clutched her small bag tightly and tried not to make eye contact with anyone. The showcase was organized by performance order, and Elena had drawn a slot near the end. This meant she had to sit through hours of other pianists before her turn came. She found a seat in the back of the hall and watched. The other performers were good, very good. Many of them were students at prestigious conservatories, and their technique was polished and precise. They played complicated pieces with confidence, and the audience applauded warmly after each performance. And there, sitting in the front row, was Maestro Heinrich Brenner. Elena recognized him immediately. He looked exactly the same as he had a year ago. The silver hair swept back from his sharp face, the cold, calculating eyes, the expression of permanent judgment. He sat with his arms crossed, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to the person next to him. Sometimes he nodded slightly. More often, he frowned. Watching him made Elena's stomach churn. For a moment, she felt the old fear creeping back in, the voice that whispered she didn't belong here, that she was fooling herself, that she should slip out the back door before she embarrassed herself again. But then she thought about her grandmother. She thought about Brigitte and the retired pianist who had taught her and everyone else who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. She thought about the girl who had walked off that stage a year ago with her head held high, refusing to let them see her break. She wasn't that girl anymore. She was stronger now. Better. The fear didn't disappear completely, but she pushed it aside and stayed in her seat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, her name was called. Elena stood up. Her legs felt strange, almost numb. As she walked down the aisle toward the stage, she could feel hundreds of eyes on her. She could see Brenner looking up from his papers, and she watched recognition flicker across his face. He remembered her. Good. She climbed the steps to the stage and walked to the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a full concert grand that gleamed under the spotlight. She sat down on the bench and adjusted it slightly. She placed her hands in her lap and took a deep breath. The hall fell silent. Everyone was watching, waiting. Elena looked out at the audience. She found Brenner's eyes in the front row. He was staring at her, with that same expression of cool assessment, waiting to judge her, waiting to find her lacking. She held his gaze for just a moment. Then she turned to the piano. The opening of La Campanella was deceptively simple. A gentle melody in the right hand, meant to imitate the sound of a distant bell. Elena played it softly, letting the notes ring out clear and pure. So far, so good. Then the first difficult passage arrived. A huge leap across the keyboard, followed by rapid trills that had to be light as air. Elena's fingers moved with perfect precision. She didn't think about the notes anymore. Her body knew what to do. She just had to trust it. The music grew more complex. Elena navigated the treacherous sections with a calm she didn't entirely feel. Her hands flew across the keys, hitting every note exactly where it needed to be. The piece demanded speed, and she gave it speed. It demanded delicacy, and she gave it delicacy. It demanded passion, and she gave it everything she had. She was no longer aware of the audience. She wasn't aware of Brenner or the other judges or any of the people who had doubted her. There was only the music, pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. The final section of La Campanella was the hardest of all. A cascading run of notes that seemed to go on forever, building and building until it felt like the piano itself might explode. Elena attacked it with fierce concentration. Her fingers were a blur. The music filled the hall, bright and triumphant and alive. And then, with one final flourish, it was over. The last note hung in the air. Elena sat at the piano, breathing hard, her heart pounding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Then the applause began. It started slowly at first, a few scattered claps from somewhere in the middle of the hall. Then more joined in, and more, until the sound swelled into something Elena had never experienced before. The applause grew louder and louder, washing over her like a wave she couldn't control. Then people started standing up. One person near the back rose to their feet, still clapping. Then another. Then a whole row. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, giving her a standing ovation that shook the walls of the concert hall. Elena sat frozen at the piano. She didn't know what to do. She had imagined this moment so many times over the past year, but the reality of it was overwhelming. Her eyes blurred with tears she was trying desperately to hold back. Her hands were trembling in her lap. She looked out at the sea of faces. Some people were cheering. Others were wiping their eyes. An elderly woman in the third row was pressing her hand to her heart, like she had just witnessed something sacred. And then Elena's gaze found Maestro Heinrich Brenner. He was still sitting down. He hadn't joined the standing ovation. His face was completely still, unreadable, like a mask carved from stone. Elena felt a flicker of the old fear. Had she failed again? Had her performance not been enough? But then she noticed something. Brenner's hands were resting on his knees, and they were gripping the fabric of his trousers so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His jaw was clenched. His eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that was almost frightening. He wasn't unmoved. He was struggling to contain himself. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Elena finally remembered to stand and take a bow. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she managed to stay upright. She bowed once, then again, then a third time as the clapping showed no signs of stopping. Eventually, the host of the showcase stepped onto the stage and gently guided Elena aside. There were other performers still waiting, and the show had to go on. Elena walked off the stage in a daze, barely aware of where she was going. She found a quiet corner backstage and leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Her whole body was shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. She had done it. She had actually done it. But the evening wasn't over yet. After the final performer finished, there was a short intermission before the judges would give their remarks. This was the part of the showcase that everyone dreaded. Brenner was famous for his harsh critiques, and even performers who had played well could be torn apart by his sharp tongue. Elena thought about leaving. She had already proven what she came to prove. Did she really need to stand there and listen to whatever Brenner had to say? Part of her wanted to walk out the door, head held high, and never look back. But another part of her needed to hear it, needed to face him one more time. So she stayed. The judges took their seats on the stage, and Brenner sat in the center, a microphone in front of him. The audience grew quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. The other judges went first, offering their thoughts on the various performances. They were complimentary toward Elena, praising her technique and musicality, calling her one of the standout performers of the evening. But everyone knew their opinions didn't really matter. Everyone was waiting for Brenner. When his turn finally came, he sat in silence for a long moment. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully, which was unusual for a man known for speaking his mind without hesitation. Finally, he leaned toward the microphone. "I have been teaching and judging pianists for over 50 years, he began. His voice was quieter than usual, almost contemplative. In that time, I have seen thousands of performers. Most of them are competent. Some of them are talented. A very few are exceptional." He paused, and his eyes scanned the audience until they found Elena, standing near the back of the hall. "1 year ago, a young woman came to audition for my master class. She was self-taught, with no formal credentials, no prestigious teachers, no connections. She played with obvious passion but lacked the technical foundation I considered essential. I rejected her. I told her to go home. I told her she didn't belong here." A murmur rippled through the audience. People were turning to look at Elena now, realizing who Brenner was talking about. He continued, "I was not kind in my assessment. I believed I was doing her a favor by being honest. I believed that false hope was crueler than hard truth. I told her she played like a peasant girl, and I meant it as a statement of fact." Elena felt her face burning. Hearing him repeat those words in front of everyone was almost as painful as hearing them the first time. But she forced herself to keep listening. Brenner's expression shifted. Something softened in his eyes, something Elena had never seen before. Tonight, that same young woman returned. She played one of the most demanding pieces in the repertoire, and she played it flawlessly. Not just technically flawless, although it was certainly that. She played with a depth of feeling and a clarity of purpose that I rarely encounter. She played like someone who has earned every single note through struggle and sacrifice and sheer force of will. He stopped and took a breath. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "I was wrong about her. I have spent my entire career believing that proper training is the only path to greatness. That raw talent must be molded by experts, shaped by institutions, refined through formal education. Miss Vasquez has proven that there is another path. A harder path, perhaps. A lonelier one, but a valid one nonetheless." The hall was completely silent. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Brenner stood up from his chair. It was a slow, deliberate movement, and it drew every eye in the room. He looked directly at Elena, and for the first time, there was no coldness in his gaze. No judgment. No contempt. "Miss Vasquez," he said, "I owe you an apology. Not for my standards, which I stand by, but for my presumption. I presumed to know your limits when I had only seen a glimpse of who you were. I presumed that you could not grow, could not change, could not become something greater than what I saw that day. That was arrogant of me, and I was wrong." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the silent hall. "You do not play like a peasant girl. You play like someone who has walked through fire and come out stronger on the other side. You play like an artist, and it has been a privilege to hear you tonight." Then Maestro Heinrich Brenner, the man who never praised anyone, the man who had crushed countless dreams with his harsh words, did something that made the entire audience gasp. He began to clap. Slowly at first, then faster. And as he clapped, he nodded at Elena with something that looked almost like respect. The audience erupted. The applause was even louder than before, mixed with cheers and shouts. People were crying openly now. The other judges were on their feet, clapping along with everyone else. Elena stood in the back of the hall, tears streaming down her face, unable to move. A year of pain and struggle and doubt, all leading to this moment. She had come to Vienna to prove something to herself, and she had done it. But she had also received something she never expected: recognition, respect, an apology from the man who had once tried to break her. After the event ended, Brenner found her backstage. He walked up to her slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "What will you do now?" he finally asked. Elena wiped her eyes and looked at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Keep playing. Keep learning. Keep growing." He nodded slowly. "Good. That is the only answer worth giving." He hesitated, then added, "If you ever want a place in my masterclass, it is yours. No audition required." Elena smiled. The first real smile she had allowed herself in a very long time. "Thank you, Maestro. I'll think about it." He returned the smile, just barely. "You do that." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Elena alone with the echo of applause still ringing in her ears. She thought about her grandmother back home. Probably asleep by now. Probably dreaming of the little girl who used to play piano in a dusty church. She thought about her mother, who had told her to never give up. She thought about everyone who had helped her along the way. She had silenced the maestro, not with anger, not with revenge, but with the only thing that had ever truly mattered: the music. And as Elena walked out of the concert hall and into the cool Vienna night, she knew that this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning.